Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. And some of what I'm talking about here will echo things that I've said in the Simon's workshop earlier, but since no one ever remembers everything, I hope that this will, I hope that there won't be too much repetition. And also there's a bunch of new results that I want to talk about since then. So let me start out by saying something about the human evolutionary niche. And what I want to argue is that essentially immigration is our niche. From the time that we evolved, what made us special was our ability to deal with non-stationary, out-of-distribution environments. That's what we're all about. There's actually some very cool recent DNA work that shows that literally from the time that hominins evolved, what we were doing was moving and moving around at much higher rates and across much greater distances than we might have imagined. And a point that Ken mentioned, because we're social animals, we have even more of a non-stationary environment, because what we're doing is we're actually modifying our evolutionary niches, and the fact that we change the way that we interact socially. So what that means is that we are creatures that are adapted to unpredictable novel environments, and that makes us drastically different from current AI models. So in a way, it's sort of like everything that the AI models would say they can't do: deal with continual learning, deal with non-stationary environments, deal with out-of-distribution samples. That's exactly what humans are designed to do. And what that means is that one important way that we do that is that we learn novel world models. So it isn't just that we have models of the world, we have causal models in particular of the world. That's something that really helps us to navigate the world. But we can learn brand new ones from our experience. And that's how we deal with this non-stationarity. So what we do is get plunked into a new environment, and each generation in that new environment can figure out something about the causal structure of that environment, including the causal structure of the social environment. And what I'm going to do in this talk is suggest in the first half of the talk some ways that might be possible, or at least an approach that would make that possible. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about a particular kind of social relationship, very neglected and understudied, namely caregiving, that might be a crucial ingredient in allowing this ability to learn novel causal models. Okay. And part of the reason why this is such a hard problem is because of the famous classic tension between exploration and exploitation. So if your job is to be in the non-stationary environment, be in the new environment, learn a novel causal model of that environment, that's going to be in real tension with just accumulating as much reward as you can, functioning as well as you can in that novel environment. Those two things are really different, and they're going to be characteristically in tension with one another. Because as we'll see, the sort of things that you need to do to be able to learn a novel causal model are do experiments, try things that are novel, try things that have a low probability of success, try things where you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And those are all not good strategies if what you want to do is just succeed and accomplish your goals and get the maximum amount of reward. So a really important question is, given that humans are these immigrants in the non-stationary environment who learn novel causal models, how do they manage to accomplish exploration? And again, that's something that is not typical of any of the recent AI models. They just aren't doing that. What they're doing is taking a vast amount of information and data from humans and using it to implement actions and perform goals. What they're not doing is going out and finding out new things about the world that aren't in the training set that they don't already know about. And in principle, that's something that they can't do. Okay. So how could you solve this problem? Well, it's interesting that causal models have actually had, in the context of this institute, there's actually been a lot of formal work over 20 years or so trying to characterize what causal models are like, and even trying to explain how you could learn those causal models. This is work most famously probably by Judea Pearl, but lots of other people have done this. So we have formal models of causal relationships, often probabilistic graphical models. And it turns out that those causal models are a very good way of characterizing the causal models that humans have, including the causal models that even very young children have. All right, given that you can get this formal characterization of a causal model, how do you learn it? How do you get a new one? And the standard way that people have tried to approach this is with some kind of Bayesian inference. So the picture is you have a group of hypotheses, you have a whole group of causal models you can choose from. The causal models generate patterns of data, and what that means is you can do the kind of Bayesian inversion, and from the patterns of data you should be able to figure out what the most likely causal model is. And the trouble is that that doesn't work. And a bit like what Jack was saying, we've been trying to do this for 20 years, and it still doesn't work. It just comes up against these really intractable search and sampling kinds of problems. And notice that this way of solving the problem doesn't include any active exploration. So this way of solving the problem sort of assumes there's a data stream that's floating past you, and you have some set of potential hypotheses, and you just update those hypotheses based on the data. That's kind of the Bayesian picture. But what humans actually do, including very young children, is to go out and actively try and get novel data from the world. And there isn't any simple way of doing this, or even complicated way of doing this in the Bayesian framework. Now, another framework that has been extremely influential and successful as a learning framework, especially in AI, is this framework of reinforcement learning. Everybody here will know about this. And again, this is something that is has been formally specified in great detail, and you can do a lot of math with this approach. As I always say, as a boomer cognitive scientist, when I first saw the revival of reinforcement learning, I was sort of horrified. I thought, didn't we get rid of that in like 1965? Or are we all going to have to wear bell bottoms now? Is that the story of our going back to the future? But of course, the novel approaches to reinforcement learning are more sophisticated and in some ways and more interesting than the ones in the 50s, although I think they still have some of the same kinds of limitations that the ones in the 50s had. But reinforcement learning, unlike kind of classical neural net or associationist learning, is a kind of good model for causal learning, because what reinforcement learning is all about is you take an action on the world and then see what the outcome of that action is. So in a way, reinforcement learning, just in its very nature, is a very simple form of exploration. That's what it's all about. It's about how do you explore, how do you take actions and see the outcomes of those actions, and then use that as a way of guiding your future behavior. But of course, in practice, it's extremely limited. So it's just motivated by utility, by what the rewards are going to be like. It's effective in very narrow environments like chess and AlphaGo. Notoriously, this is the idea behind, this is the idea that succeeded. And it plays a really important role, by the way, in an important and I think somewhat underemphasized role in the modern LLMs. A lot of what they're doing is not because of next token prediction, not because of the pre-training, but because you do a lot of this reinforcement learning in the post-training. But it has difficulty when you've got an open-ended high-dimensional environment, and of course, again, that's our environment. That's the environment that we evolved in. So a question is there a way, and it faces these explore-exploit trade-offs, and in fact, those explore-exploit trade-offs have been articulated most clearly in the context of reinforcement learning. On the other hand, if you think about causal learning sort of has the opposite profile. So it's epistemically motivated. It's not motivated by utility. So if you're trying to learn a causal model, you might have a later decision-making process that tells you that causal model is going to be useful, but you're not concerned about how useful it's going to be at the time that you're learning it. And it allows structured hypotheses and models and superior generalization. Interesting, I mean, one way you could think about this problem is, although there are model-based RL systems, there aren't RL systems that use RL to construct models, and that's really what you want to have happen. That's really the question. And as I said, it faces intractable search and sampling problems, and it doesn't have any theory of exploration or active learning. So it seems like you might be able to find some way of combining these two approaches in a way that would solve this problem of learning novel causal models. And in fact, I think there's a kind of path forward to do this, and that is to think about intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning, which is something that people have been independently interested in. So in intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning, instead of instead of the reward being the typical sort of utility reward, the reward is an epistemic reward. And people have done a lot of work looking at things like curiosity or information gain or novelty as rewards in RL, and then see if that allows you to explore. Yeah?
You called AlphaGo narrow environment. It's practically infinite in dimensions.
Well, it's narrow in the sense that the reward structure is very narrow and well-defined.
So dimensionality.
Yeah, exactly.
Something else.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about what we mean by dimensionality. But certainly in terms of the reward structure in AlphaGo, you know what the right answer is going to be. And typically in human environments, especially in these non-stationary environments, you don't know what the right answer is going to be. You don't know what the goal is. You don't know what the right reward is to pursue. And so you have to do this epistemic stage of figuring out what the environment actually is like. Whereas with something like AlphaGo, the parameters of the environment are very well defined. You know what they're going to be. Okay. The trouble with these kinds of information theoretic rewards is that they lead to overly broad exploration. So another boomer example is the static ETV problem. If you just stand there and look at a TV that's producing random static, you're going to have a lot of novelty, you're going to have a lot of information gain, it's going to be a waste of your life, right? So that's not a strategy that you really want to use. And an idea that's actually quite an old idea is an idea called empowerment. Now, it's sort of like 20 years old before this was first articulated. And the idea of empowerment is you want to use something that's an epistemic information theoretic reward signal, but it's about the relationship between your actions and their outcomes. So what you really want to do is to reward actions that have predictable outcomes. And there's two pieces to this. One of them is you want to find things that you can control out in the environment, but also you want a lot of variability. So you don't want to just be stuck in a kind of casino loop of controlling things. You want to also you also get rewarded for producing a wide range of different kinds of actions. So it's got both controllability and variability. And then doing that, what you want to do is maximize the mutual information between actions and outcomes at the same time that you're maximizing the diversity of actions that you're performing. And if you have this as your intrinsic reward, that's going to mean that you'll reward exploration, but not just any kind of exploration. You're going to be rewarding exploration that will lead to the discovery of causal structure in your environment. And what I've been arguing, I've talked about this at Simons before for the last little while, is that if you think about this conceptually, philosophically, that actually this empowerment gain is causal learning and vice versa. Because if you go back to the Pearl causal models, what makes something causal on that view is the fact that if you intervene on the cause, then you will have something happen to the effect. And that's exactly the thing that differentiates causal models from, say, simple associations and correlations. So that's if that's your definition of causality, then any time that you're gaining empowerment, right, so you're getting a sense of how doing things out in the world is going to changes in your action is going to lead to changes in the outcome. You're understanding something causal, you're gaining causal knowledge, and vice versa. Anytime that you gain causal knowledge, the reason why you want to gain causal knowledge is because it increases empowerment. So now, if you know something about what causes what, even if you can't actually act on it directly, so if I know that the moon causes the tides, even if I can't go in and wiggle the moon, I know that in principle, if I wiggled the moon, it would cause the tides to be different. And again, this is very different from other kinds of knowledge you could have, like simple correlational or associational knowledge or geometric knowledge or other kinds of knowledge. Now, here's where I will make a Simons-specific plea, which is, I think this conceptual sort of philosophical link between these two ideas is really important and interesting. It's kind of weird because there's a formalism for causal inference and causal models, and there's a formalism for RL and empowerment gain, and nobody's tried to put the two formalisms together, and there's not an easy mapping from one formalism to the other, and I could talk about some of the problems that come up when you try and do that. So I have this plea out about trying to figure out what the formal mathematical relationship, given that these are both formal theories, what a formal way of characterizing this relationship, which conceptually seems to be quite close, and as we'll see in a minute, is empirically quite close. Okay. So part of the reason, and again, this is in a couple of recent papers, part of the reason why I think this is so interesting is that if you look in psychology, and particularly in developmental psychology, you see empowerment all the time. So this is an experiment from the 70s, and it's interesting because the background was that Carolyn Roby Collier was a reinforcement learning person back in the olden days. She wanted to see if babies could be operantly conditioned, so she designed this very nice setup where the baby's leg is tied to the mobile. She wanted to see if the babies could be conditioned to make the mobile move. And what she discovered was you didn't have to have any reward, including the mobile itself. As soon as you put babies in that setting, they start kicking. And it isn't just that they start kicking, they'll try one foot, then they'll try the other foot, they'll kick for a little bit, then they'll stop kicking, they look up at the mobile. If you just use the mobile, it's not, or doesn't function as a reward for the babies. And my favorite part, they giggle. Right? If you see a 3-month-old, they giggle, they coo, they act as if they're really being rewarded. They're really, really happy to do this kind of contingency, and there's lots of general evidence that babies are doing this. As I always say, as a developmental psychologist, part of my moral duty is to have a cute baby video. So this is Kit, and hopefully you can hear this, who you may remember as my co-recipient of the Rummelhart Prize. And Kit's grandfather is actually playing the piano in the background, and he's given Kit this xylophone. And what Kit does is try one end of the stick first, and then he tries the other end of the stick, and then he tries his fat little hand, which has no effect at all, and then he tries it on the smaller bars, and he tries it on the further bars. And in the course of doing this, what he's doing is discovering this causal relation, which is not a causal relation that could have been, say, part of your evolutionary background, right? The idea that there's this relationship between hand movements with sticks and pure tones is not something that's out there before, but a very important one to discover if, like Kit, you're in the framework of a very musical household. Okay. So I'm just going to skip through this quickly. You can, look on archive for this. What we've been doing for the past couple of years is trying to see empirically if children are maximizing empowerment gain when they explore, children and adults, and how that is related to their causal learning, and what happens if you put artificial agents in similar kinds of contexts. And maybe an interesting methodological point is the reason why no one had really done this before is because it's very hard to do if you're in a natural setting. So, you see something like that little video of Kit, and you say, oh, look, he's really experimenting. But it's hard to quantify that. And the nice thing is that now we have online environments where we can quantify the exploration that someone is doing in that environment, and we know something about, we can also quantify the structure of the environment. And 20 years ago when we first started doing this work, if you put a baby in an online environment, they wouldn't do anything. Nowadays, you put the baby in front of a screen, and the first thing they do is try to interact with it and bring about outcomes. For better or for worse, but definitely for better from an experimental perspective. So as I say, I'll just gesture at these different studies. This is a study that's under revision at PNAS with Ali Lidan, who's here. And in this study, what we did was take a Minecraft environment, which is a very open-ended kind of high-dimensional environment without any kind of straightforward reward structure. And then we just let kids explore, and we compared that with various kinds of agents. And the kids' exploration is well characterized by empowerment gain, and the more they're doing something like maximizing empowerment gain, the better they are at exploring this structure. In this study, we used something called Little Alchemy, which is a similar kind of online environment, and in this case, what you're doing is trying to bring about a particular outcome by putting different kinds of herbs into this pot and then creating a new herb. And in this experiment, we could explicitly ask about the causal structure of the problem. What will happen if you put this new combination of herbs into the pot? And we found that, again, the exploration both of adults and children could be best characterized as empowerment gain. And we compared that, Jack will appreciate this, perhaps, to information gain, to novelty, to a bunch of other measures, and empowerment gain does a better job of modeling than those other kinds of measures. And that was related to how good people were at figuring out the causal structure, how well they did in understanding the causal structure of the system, and again, compared that to various kinds of agents. In this experiment, which is just posted on arXiv, we used a version of our Blicket detector to look at causal inference and exploration, and again, what we found is that adults do, if you give them the chance, will do active exploration to pull out causal structure. They do that much better than LLMs do. And in the last experiment with Kelsey Allen, what we did was look at a kind of intuitive physics framework where you have to figure out how to make something happen in this intuitive physics framework. The intuitive physics framework is not exactly like everyday physics. We can alter what the physics of these frameworks are. And again, what we find is kids will explore by trying to get maximum empowerment gain. We give them a phase where we say, just figure out how this works, just play with this. And then we ask them to actually use a tool to bring about a particular outcome. And again, the more they are trying to maximize empowerment in their exploration, the better they are at actually using the tool to bring about the causal outcome. Okay. So all this suggests that from a very early age and very effectively, maximizing empowerment is a really good strategy for trying to figure out a novel causal model. And again, I want to emphasize that this is epistemic. So what's the problem with trying to do this? The problem with trying to do this is the rewards are not utility rewards. And in fact, very often they're counter-utility rewards. So if you go back to that little video of Kit, the one thing that his grandfather says is, Kit, don't put it in your mouth. And people with small children who watch this video say, oh my God, he's going to poke his eye out with that stick. The stick is, why are you letting him play with a pointy, sharp end of the stick? And indeed, I have had more than one grandchild who ended up in the ER as a result of their their attempts to maximize their empowerment. And this is a beautiful experiment, one of my favorite experiments in psychology that demonstrates this. This is, again, Back to the Future, going back to classic 101 reinforcement learning. You put the rat in a maze, it goes down one arm of the maze, nothing happens. It goes down the other arm of the maze, it gets a shock. It never goes down the arm of the maze that involves a shock ever again. Which is good from a utility exploit perspective, not good from an explore perspective, because maybe things will change in the future. Definitely not good from a non-stationary if the environment is non-stationary. And what Regina Sullivan and colleagues and then Nim Tottenham discovered, Regina Sullivan found this for rats and Nim found it for children, is that that's true with adult rats, but it's not true for juvenile rats. The juvenile rats actually prefer the arm of the maze that leads to the shock, even though you can show that they don't like the shock, because they're getting empowerment, right? They're getting information. They're actually figuring out that there's a consistent relationship between their actions and outcomes, even if the outcomes are these bad outcomes. But there's a very interesting twist to this, which is that both little rats and the same thing's true about 3- and 4-year-olds, and if any of you have children or grandchildren of that age, you will recognize this, that this is true. But here's the catch. The catch is they'll only do it if the mother is present for the rats. In fact, if the odor of the mother is present. You can pipe in the mom smell, and then they'll do the empowerment piece. If they don't have the mom smell, then they do the kind of classic reinforcement learning piece. And the same thing is true for children. So that leads me to the second part of the talk, which is that, so what this suggests, and this is sort of, if you think about it conceptually, in order to be able to have this intrinsic empowerment-based goal, you need to have some other agent who's making sure you don't kill yourself in the course of doing this, right? And who's also, by the way, making sure that you have, rat pellets and peanut butter sandwiches that will keep you alive during this period when you're doing exploration, because you don't care about utility when you're in this explore state. And the adaptation that goes along with this adaptation to novel causal models, non-stationary environments, is caregiving. And I'll just parenthetically say, when Ken was talking about the Machiavellian intelligence, it's interesting that even though there's a lot of interest in social intelligence, this social relationship, the relationship of one person taking care of another, is completely invisible. You could read all of social science, political science, economics, moral psychology, moral philosophy. Nobody ever talks about caregiving. My colleague and I who did this at one point said, is there something that all these people have in common that could explain why none of it has not occurred to any of them that for humans to take care of other humans is really central to human thriving? And we decided it's because they're tall. They're all taller than the other people who care about caregiving. But if you think about it from the perspective of evolution, not only do humans have this tremendous capacity to, so our project has been to do a cognitive science and a computational science of caregiving. Could we give a computational cognitive science kind of account of this really central social relationship, and what implications would it have for other kinds of things that people could do? And this is very relevant evolutionarily because in addition to having this immigration niche, we have much more caregiving than any of our close primate relatives. In fact, than any other animal that we know about. So we have what I think of as the investment triple threat. We have pair bonding and fathers who are involved in taking care of babies. That's very unusual among mammals. We have alloparents, so we have non-kin who are involved in caregiving. We have my personal favorite, the postmenopausal grandmothers who serve this niche. And not only that, but I think in a kind of exaptation way, we've taken that, the neuroscience, the neuroscientific and the computational capacities to take care of babies that have a kind of obvious evolutionary advantage for mammals. And now we as humans can extend it to partners, and we know something about the neuroscience of that, but we also extend it to elders, to students, to patients, to all sorts of other human, to the natural world, to the planet. So we can kind of take this basic structure of caregiving, and then we can apply it in all these other frameworks, and that gives us all sorts of other kinds of social advantages that go well beyond what you have if you're just thinking about competition or cooperation in the classic kind of way. And let me just quickly, and another thing that caregiving seems to do is to allow culture. So it seems to be that one of the reasons why we're a uniquely cultural animal is that, in fact, it's those postmenopausal grandmothers who are passing on cultural information to the next generation. But at the same time, caregiving is very puzzling from a computational perspective because all of our accounts of social interaction, our computational accounts of social interaction, depend on some kind of social contract reciprocity sort of story. So they're all extensions of utility theory. The idea is you have two agents, A and B, and they have goals, they have resources. What happens when two of them are interacting? Well, here's some of the things that can happen. Classic story is they have a social contract, they exchange, they get more benefit, more utility than they would individually. Sometimes what happens is one of them has more resources, A has more resources than B, and therefore B subordinates their goals to A. That's true in all sorts of power relationships. But the thing that's so bizarre about care is that the structure of care is that A has more resources than B, and the result is that for that very reason, A is subordinating their goals to B's goals. So exactly because your graduate students are so pathetic and don't know anything and are so feeble, that's exactly the reason why you spend all this time and energy to give them your time and energy to get them to be more competent and to be able to do things out in the world. I hope whenever I do this, I sort of think, well, with tall people, maybe talking about the babies isn't going to be as vivid. So if I talk about graduate students, that will kind of invoke this. Although I've discovered that about 3/4 of the tall people say, yeah, that's right, that's what you do, and about 1/4 say, what? I just get them to do the next thing in my grant, right? Like, so that's one thing that's really puzzling about how. Care works. And I would make the philosophical argument that any relationship of care, even to non-human animals, even to the planet, has this kind of structure. That's what makes it a relationship of care. If you think about institutions like charities, they have this, that's the thing that makes a charity different from other kinds of social institutions. And then there's this problem about what the objective function of care is. So if you're actually doing this, so if you say the structure is you're trying to accomplish goals for the other agent, but it's not even as simple as that, because one thing that you could be doing is you could be trying to maximize the objective utilities of the other agent, right? But that's not usually what you're doing in care. That's what you're doing sometimes. But you also have to coordinate that with the recipient's subjective utilities. So if I am, giving my grandson peanut butter sandwiches, that's helping his objective utilities. If I tried to maximize his subjective utilities, we would sit and watch Paw Patrol all day long, in spite of its negative effect on my objective utilities. And I think, to go back to the original point about empowerment, a really nice way of describing at least a lot of care cases is you're not doing either of those things. Take that formal quantitative information theoretic definition of empowerment, and now think about what one agent could do to maximize the empowerment of another agent. So that baby, playing with a mobile, or kid playing with a stick, is maximizing their own empowerment. But in a sense, Kit's grandfather, by giving him that stick and that mobile, and then saying, don't hit yourself with the stick, is maximizing the other person's empowerment. He's giving him a chance to try to figure out what the causal relationships are. And again, if you think about, your graduate students, that's what you really want to do, is give them resources so that they can go out and have different goals than the ones that you started out with, and nevertheless have resources that will enable them to be empowered. And there's starting to be some really lovely computational work about caregiving, and a really interesting idea that Max Clement-Weiner has had is it's got this kind of developmental structure where one way to think about it is you're doing something in this period to maximize the empowerment of the other agent, with the understanding that you're not going to be there later on. So what can I do now such that this other agent is going to be able to accomplish goals when I'm not there to accomplish the goals for them anymore? Again, which is very much like what happens when we're teaching, or we're taking care of an elderly person, or we're taking care of a patient. So this relates back to, if you think about that experiment, the Regina Sullivan experiment, this relates back to the point about exploration being really important. Deepak Pathak, who was a student here, we collaborated on with some of these early curiosity-based pieces, was giving a talk recently, and they had a robotic system that was trying to use curiosity as a way of being trained. And he said, the problem is, like, you lose 4 or 5 of the robots in the course of their empowerment exploration. And they're really expensive, so it's not really great if they're breaking things as they, it's not really great if they're breaking things as they're doing the curiosity and play and exploration, which may be part of the reason why the babies all have those nice, well-padded bums, so you don't have to worry about losing too many of them.
Only for autonomous driving, you cannot afford to do this kind of
Yeah, exactly. But if you have caregivers, then that might be a way of having a kind of empowerment relationship. So the last thing that I'll say, this is this beautiful novella by Ted Chiang, where he envisions what it would be like if you actually had autonomous goal-directed AI agents and you raised them. What you would have to do is care for them. So the famous alignment problem is, how do you manage to get the goals of the AI aligned with your goals? A way that people think about that is some form of slavery where you just dictate that they'll have your goals. Or maybe you have the Stepford wife solution where you persuade them to figure out what your goals are and then do the things that they think that you want them to do. Neither of those seem very satisfactory if you're going to have a genuinely autonomous agent. But caregiving could be a really good model, both for how you would take care of an autonomous agent and also how you want those autonomous agents to deal with you. So if you're thinking about an agent that could help you to do something, you don't really want it to dictate, here's the best way to solve this problem. What you want it to do is give you resources so that you can imagine different goals. And finally, that's especially important in the context of these non-stationary environments, because it isn't just that you're going to be figuring out different causal models of those environments, but you're also going to want to have different goals as the environment is changing. So how is it possible for you to actually have an objective function that's changing in the light of the environment, not just having a model that's changing in the light of the environment? And what I want to argue is that's exactly what having a mom enables you to do. What it lets you do is a mom, metaphorically speaking, as well as literally speaking. That enables you to change your objective function. So let me stop there, and we can have some questions. Yeah.
So to take up your challenge, the Simon's workshop, it's almost $1 trillion industry using reinforcement learning to synthesize with a little bit of context programs, right? Which represent all of these deep probabilistic causal structures. But the way that these things learn, takes entire countries worth of energy. It's not how we learn at all. Is there a way for, us computer scientists to look at how humans, actually do meta-learning in these really fast, restrictive, contexts? Are there studies from, the developmental psychology literature that, might be informative that we should kind of take inspiration or more than that from?
Well, let me give you just a really crude way that I've been thinking about this, which is, imagine you've got one of these empowerment agents, right? So to start out with, it's not trying to do any utility-based RL. It just goes out and it's in a framework where the variable set and the action set is very restricted to start out with. So, think about the baby, think about Kit. Kit's got a very restricted set of policies and actions, namely the ones that he can actually do, right? What his motor system is telling him. So he doesn't have the problem of figuring out what all the possible action space is. That's already determined. And he's got a very well-defined set of variables, namely his perceptual system telling him about objects and their relationships, right? So I think if you have that kind of start out from that restricted variable set and that restricted set of actions, the nice thing about empowerment is that, at least the picture is, that could bootstrap your way to novel variables and novel actions. So Kit is sitting there and starts out just saying, I'm going to bang this. But as he's banging it, he notices that sometimes the banging makes noise and sometimes it doesn't. And now that gives him a way of differentiating his actions, and now he can take that action set and apply it in a new setting. Now that's obviously not formal, that's just sort of an intuitive picture, but it seems to me in principle you should be able to formalize that, that kind of process. Another thing that I was going to mention is, I think control theory has things to say about this. I was going to mention this from what Jatinder was talking about, but that's just another formalism that hasn't really made contact with either causal learning or reinforcement learning, as far as I can tell.
Let's do one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the beginning you said causal and empowerment were sort of equivalent.
Yeah.
But actually, it seems to me causal implies empowerment, but the other way doesn't, except if you include the caring. So empowerment plus caring gives you causal. Causal gives you empowerment. So I think you have to use that other condition with.
So I think it's really interesting if you think about the empowerment case. One of the consequences is, like, maximizing your empowerment from the usual perspective could just make you more skilled, right? So think about, Kit's grandfather, right? And I think it's a really interesting consequence of this, that getting to be more skillful and getting a better causal model are actually very, very deeply related to one another.
But
so
caring is important in the other direction. Also, it's
what I'm saying, yeah. But in principle, you could have the robots that go out and do empowerment without caring. It's just that you're going to lose a lot of them because they're going to die because they're going to do dangerous, stupid things. So I think, they're going to be finding out causal models of the world. Your teenagers, are doing that, causal models of the social world. It's just that you have this problem about them crashing their cars and not surviving from an evolutionary perspective. So my argument would be empowerment theoretically should imply causal models and vice versa. And that, as I say, I think that's interesting because the case of empowerment leading to the causal model, I think it's kind of obvious from if you have a good causal model, it will lead to empowerment. But the case of empowerment leading to causal model would mean that you'd say that something like being a very expert pianist is having a causal model of the piano that's different from the causal model of a novice, even though the pianist might have a hard time, explicitly saying, here's what my causal model of the piano is. But then I think you need caregiving just to stay alive while you're doing all that.
I'm going to break this so that we can go have lunch. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So we are going to break for lunch. If you are a member of the audience, we bid you goodbye.